Have you ever been in a situation where you felt so small, so invisible, that people thought they could say anything to you without consequences? Have you ever swallowed your pride, forced a smile, and pretended that words didn't cut through you like broken glass? I have. For years, I accepted comments that slowly chipped away at my self-worth, comments disguised as jokes, wrapped in sarcasm, delivered with a smile that never reached their eyes. I told myself I was being too sensitive, that I should have thicker skin, that maybe they didn't mean it the way it sounded. But deep down, in that quiet space where truth lives and denial dies, I knew exactly what was happening. I was being disrespected, diminished, and devalued, one casual remark at a time. And the worst part? Everyone expected me to just take it. They expected me to laugh along, to be the good sport, to understand that it was all in good fun. But here's what nobody tells you about being the target of constant disrespect. It doesn't feel like fun. It feels like drowning in a room full of people who could throw you a lifeline but choose to watch instead. It feels like screaming underwater where nobody can hear you, where your pain becomes background noise to their entertainment. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I went from being someone who absorbed every verbal blow with a forced smile to someone who started calling out the disrespect every single time, no matter how uncomfortable it made people feel. This is about the moment I decided that my peace of mind was worth more than their comfort, that my dignity was not negotiable, and that silence in the face of disrespect was not strength but self-betrayal. I worked at a marketing firm in downtown Chicago, a place that prided itself on creativity and innovation, but somehow managed to foster one of the most toxic work environments I've ever experienced. The office was modern, all glass walls and open spaces, the kind of place that looked perfect in photographs but felt suffocating in reality. There were about 30 of us on my floor, and we were supposed to be a team, a creative family working toward common goals. But families don't treat each other the way my colleagues treated me. It started small, so small that I almost missed it at first. A comment here about my outfit being too conservative, a joke there about my lack of social life, a casual observation that I seemed too serious all the time. My supervisor, Marcus, had this way of delivering criticism that felt like a punch wrapped in velvet. He would say things like, "Sarah, you know we love you, but maybe try to be a little less intense in meetings. You're scaring the interns." And everyone would laugh, and I would laugh too, because that's what you do when you want to fit in, when you want to prove you can take a joke, when you're terrified of being labeled as difficult or oversensitive. But those comments accumulated like poison in my system, each one adding to a reservoir of hurt that I pretended didn't exist. My coworker Jennifer had a particular talent for backhanded compliments that left me feeling worse than straightforward insults ever could. She would look at my presentations and say, "Wow, Sarah, this is actually really good. I'm surprised you pulled this off." The word "actually" hung in the air like a question mark over my competence, and the phrase "surprised you pulled this off" suggested that my success was an anomaly rather than a reflection of my abilities. When I wore something a little more fashionable than my usual attire, she would say, "Oh, Sarah's trying something new. How brave." The word brave in that context didn't mean courageous. It meant foolish. It meant you're stepping outside your lane. It meant stay in your box where you belong. And then there was David, the office jokester who thought everything he said was comedy gold simply because he said it with a smile. He would make comments about my weight, my hair, my voice, the way I walked, the way I talked, the speed at which I ate my lunch. Nothing was off limits for David because, in his mind, he wasn't being mean. He was just being funny. And if I didn't laugh, well, then I was the problem. I was the one who couldn't take a joke. I was the one who was ruining the office vibe with my sensitivity. For months, I played along. I laughed at jokes made at my expense. I nodded when people offered unsolicited advice about my appearance, my personality, my life choices. I sat in meetings where my ideas were dismissed or attributed to someone else, and I said nothing. I watched as credit for my work went to others, and I convinced myself that speaking up would make things worse. I told myself that this was just office culture, that every workplace had its dynamics, that I needed to develop a thicker skin if I wanted to survive in the corporate world. But what I was really doing was teaching people that my boundaries didn't exist, that they could cross any line they wanted without consequence, that I was a safe target for their need to feel superior. And the more I tolerated, the worse it got. The comments became more frequent, more personal, more cutting. What started as occasional jabs evolved into a constant stream of microaggressions that left me feeling exhausted and worthless. I would go home every evening and replay the day's interactions in my mind, analyzing every comment, every look, every laugh, trying to determine if I was overreacting or if what I was experiencing was real. My partner would ask me about my day, and I would say it was fine. Because how do you explain that you're being slowly eroded by 1,000 tiny cuts that nobody else seems to notice or care about? How do you articulate the weight of accumulating disrespect when each individual comment seems too small to warrant a complaint? I started having anxiety attacks on Sunday evenings, my stomach twisting into knots at the thought of another week in that environment. I stopped sleeping well, my mind racing with conversations I should have had, responses I should have given, boundaries I should have set. I lost weight, not because I was trying to, but because stress had stolen my appetite. I stopped seeing friends, stopped pursuing hobbies, stopped doing things that brought me joy because I had no energy left after spending all day managing other people's disrespect. And still, I said nothing. I wore my silence like armor, believing that if I could just endure a little longer, if I could just prove myself a little more, if I could just be a little better at my job, then maybe the comments would stop. But that's not how disrespect works. Disrespect doesn't stop because you get better at tolerating it. It stops when you make it clear that it will no longer be tolerated. The turning point came on a random Wednesday afternoon during a team meeting that should have been routine but became the catalyst for everything that followed. We were discussing a campaign I had spent weeks developing, a project I had poured my creativity and energy into, something I was genuinely proud of. I was presenting my ideas to the team when Marcus interrupted me mid-sentence to ask David what he thought about the concept. Not what I thought about my own concept, but what David thought. And David, without missing a beat, suggested a modification that was essentially my idea rephrased in slightly different words. And Marcus loved it. He praised David for his insight, his creativity, his innovative thinking. And everyone nodded in agreement, completely ignoring the fact that David had just repeated what I had been saying before I was interrupted. I felt something crack inside me in that moment, something that had been bending under pressure for far too long. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was more like clarity, a sudden and absolute understanding that I had been complicit in my own diminishment, that by accepting disrespect, I had been giving people permission to disrespect me, that my silence had been interpreted as consent. I looked around that conference room at faces I had tried so hard to please, people whose approval I had sought at the expense of my own dignity, and I realized that I didn't respect any of them. And more importantly, they didn't respect me. Not because I wasn't worthy of respect, but because I hadn't demanded it. And in that moment of crystalline clarity, I decided that things were going to change, starting immediately. I took a breath, and for the first time in my professional life, I spoke up without worrying about how it would be received. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system, "David just repeated the exact point I was making before you interrupted me. I'd like to finish presenting my campaign before we open it up for discussion." The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of people listening, but the shocked silence of people who couldn't believe what they had just heard. Marcus looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between surprise and irritation. David laughed nervously, trying to play it off as a misunderstanding. Jennifer's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. But I didn't back down. I didn't apologize for speaking up. I didn't try to soften my words with a smile or a joke. I simply waited for Marcus to respond, holding his gaze with a confidence I hadn't known I possessed. Have you ever stood up for yourself after years of staying silent and felt the ground shift beneath your feet? That's what it felt like in that conference room, like the entire foundation of my professional relationships was being rearranged in real time. Marcus cleared his throat and gestured for me to continue, but the dynamic had changed. Everyone was paying attention now, really paying attention, not because my ideas had suddenly become more valuable, but because I had demanded that they be heard. I finished my presentation without further interruption, and when I was done, Marcus approved the campaign with minimal modifications. But the victory I felt had nothing to do with the approval and everything to do with the fact that I had finally used my voice, not to be agreeable or accommodating, but to assert my presence and my worth. After the meeting ended and people filtered back to their desks, I felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and terror. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, set a precedent I would now have to maintain, shown people a version of myself they hadn't seen before and might not like. Part of me wanted to run to Marcus's office and apologize, to smooth things over, to assure everyone that I was still the easygoing Sarah who didn't make waves. But a stronger part of me, a part that had been buried under years of people-pleasing and conflict avoidance, knew that apologizing would undo everything I had just accomplished. So I sat at my desk and worked, and when my hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline, I reminded myself that discomfort was the price of change, and I was willing to pay it. The next incident happened just 2 days later, and this time it involved Jennifer. We were in the break room, several of us grabbing coffee before the afternoon's meetings, when Jennifer looked at my lunch and said, "Is that all you're eating? No wonder you're so thin. You really should eat more, Sarah. You're starting to look sick." Several months earlier, I would have laughed it off or made some self-deprecating joke about my eating habits, but I was done with that version of myself. I turned to face Jennifer directly and said, "Jennifer, my body and my eating habits are not appropriate topics for office conversation. Please don't comment on them again." Her smile froze on her face. The other people in the break room suddenly found their phones very interesting. Jennifer's laugh was forced and defensive. "Oh my God, I was just concerned about you. There's no need to be so sensitive." And there it was, the word I had been afraid of for so long. Sensitive. The label that gets slapped on anyone who refuses to accept mistreatment with a smile. But I had learned something important in the past 48 hours. Being called sensitive by people who have no sensitivity is not an insult. It's a badge of honor. It means you still have the capacity to feel, to hurt, to recognize when something is wrong. Whether you frame it as concern or not, I responded calmly, comments about my body are not welcome. I'm not being sensitive. I'm being clear about my boundaries. I took my coffee and left the break room, leaving Jennifer to explain to the others that she was just trying to be nice, and I had totally overreacted. But here's the thing about standing up for yourself. You can't control how people will interpret your actions, and you can't prevent them from painting you as the villain in their version of events. What you can control is whether you allow their narrative to pull you back into silence. That afternoon, I heard through the office grapevine that Jennifer was telling people I had been rude to her, that I had snapped for no reason, that I was becoming difficult to work with. A few months earlier, this would have devastated me. I would have spent hours worrying about my reputation, wondering if people thought I was a troublemaker, considering whether I should apologize just to keep the peace. But the person I was becoming understood that people who benefit from your silence will always characterize your voice as aggression. They will call you difficult when you stop being convenient. They will accuse you of overreacting when you start reacting appropriately. And their discomfort with your boundaries is not your responsibility to manage. The third confrontation happened the following week with David. He made one of his typical jokes about my appearance, something about my librarian aesthetic, delivered with his characteristic grin that suggested he thought he was being charming rather than insulting. In the past, I would have laughed awkwardly, and maybe even made a joke at my own expense to show I was a good sport, but I wasn't performing for David's approval anymore. I stopped walking, turned to face him, and said, "David, your comments about my appearance are disrespectful and unwelcome. I need you to stop making them." He looked genuinely shocked, as if the thought had never occurred to him that his jokes might actually bother me. "Come on, Sarah, I'm just kidding around. You know I don't mean anything by it. This is the refuge of every person who hides cruelty behind humor. I didn't mean it." As if intention somehow negates impact. As if the absence of malicious intent makes the wounds they inflict less real. "Whether you mean anything by it or not," I said, "the impact is disrespectful. I'm asking you to stop." David's expression shifted from shock to defensiveness. "Wow, okay, I guess I can't joke around anymore. I guess everything has to be so serious now." This is another common response, making your boundary setting about them, about what they're losing, about how your self-respect is somehow an infringement on their freedom. I refuse to engage with that framing. You can joke around all you want, David, just not about my appearance. That's a reasonable boundary. I walked away before he could respond, and I heard him mutter something to a nearby colleague about people being too sensitive these days. But his opinion of my sensitivity was no longer a factor in how I valued myself. What I was learning, incident by incident, confrontation by confrontation, was that standing up for yourself is not a one-time decision, but an ongoing practice. It's not enough to set a boundary once. You have to be willing to reinforce it repeatedly, to remind people that your limits are not suggestions or starting points for negotiation, but firm lines they cannot cross. And the process is exhausting because people will test you. They will push back. They will make you feel unreasonable or difficult or oversensitive. They will tell stories that paint you as the problem. They will try to wear you down so that you go back to being the version of you that was easier for them to deal with. Over the next several weeks, I found myself in a constant state of vigilance, monitoring conversations for disrespect, preparing responses for potential boundary violations, bracing myself for the next comment that would require me to speak up. My anxiety, which I had hoped would decrease once I started advocating for myself, actually intensified because now I was hyper-aware of every interaction, every word, every tone. I was like someone learning a new language, the language of self-advocacy, and the effort of translation was mentally and emotionally draining. I started noticing patterns I had been too passive to see before. Marcus would consistently interrupt the women in our department, but never the men. Jennifer's helpful suggestions were always directed at people she perceived as beneath her in the office hierarchy. David's jokes always targeted the same few people, those of us who had historically been too polite to object. The disrespect I was experiencing was not random or personal, it was systemic, a feature of our office culture rather than a bug. And the more aware I became of these patterns, the more I realized that my individual boundary setting, while important for my own well-being, was not going to fundamentally change the environment. But it was changing me, and that mattered more than I had initially understood. Each time I called out disrespect, I was rewriting the story I had been telling myself about who I was and what I deserved. I was replacing a narrative of victimhood and passivity with one of agency and self-worth. I was proving to myself that I could survive other people's disapproval, that the temporary discomfort of confrontation was preferable to the chronic pain of silence. The reactions from my colleagues evolved over time. Some people surprisingly became more respectful. They stopped making certain comments, thought more carefully about their words, gave me space to contribute in meetings without interruption. I think seeing me set boundaries made them reflect on their own behavior, or perhaps they simply decided I was no longer a safe target and shifted their attention elsewhere. Others doubled down, treating my boundary setting as a personal affront, a challenge to their authority or their right to behave however they wanted. Marcus, in particular, seemed to view my newfound assertiveness as a threat. He started scrutinizing my work more closely, questioning decisions he would have previously approved without comment, making subtle suggestions that maybe I wasn't a good cultural fit for the team. His shift from benign neglect to active hostility was almost fascinating to witness because it revealed what I had suspected all along. He had preferred me when I was silent and compliant, when I absorbed his comments without protest, when I made his life easier by sacrificing my own comfort. Now that I was requiring him to be more thoughtful and respectful, he was finding me inconvenient. The most unexpected reaction came from a few colleagues who privately expressed admiration for what I was doing. One woman from a different department pulled me aside in the parking lot one evening and told me she had noticed the change in how I conducted myself, and it had inspired her to start setting her own boundaries. She thanked me for showing her that it was possible to be both professional and self-respecting, that the two were not mutually exclusive. Her words meant more to me than she probably realized because they reminded me that my actions had ripple effects beyond my immediate experience, that standing up for myself was not selfish but potentially liberating for others who were watching and learning. But I won't pretend that everything became easier once I started calling out disrespect. In many ways, things became harder. Relationships that had been superficially friendly became openly hostile. The social dynamics of the office shifted, and I found myself increasingly isolated from the casual camaraderie I had once been part of. Lunch invitations dried up. Water cooler conversations stopped when I approached. I was no longer invited to after-work happy hours or weekend social events. The price of my self-respect, it seemed, was my social acceptance. There were moments, particularly during the first few months of this transformation, when I questioned whether it was worth it. Was being right worth being lonely? Was protecting my dignity worth losing my sense of belonging? Was standing up for myself worth the constant tension and conflict? On my worst days, I fantasized about going back to who I had been, apologizing to everyone I had offended, smoothing over the disruption I had caused, returning to my role as the agreeable, easygoing Sarah who never made waves. It would have been so much simpler to just go back to tolerating the intolerable. But I couldn't. Once you see clearly how you've been allowing yourself to be treated, you can't unsee it. Once you taste the freedom of self-advocacy, you can't go back to swallowing your truth. Once you understand your own worth, you can't pretend to be worthless just to make other people comfortable. The change was irreversible, and even in my moments of doubt, I knew I would rather be lonely and self-respecting than popular and self-betraying. 6 months into my journey of calling out disrespect every time it occurred, something unexpected happened. Marcus called me into his office for what I assumed would be another veiled criticism or a conversation about my attitude problem. I prepared myself mentally for confrontation, rehearsing in my mind the boundaries I would set if he crossed certain lines. But when I sat down across from his desk, he surprised me. He said, "Sarah, I've been observing the changes in how you interact with the team, and I'll be honest, at first I thought you were becoming difficult to manage." I braced myself for what would come next, assuming this was the prelude to a performance improvement plan or worse. But he continued, "However, I've also noticed that the quality of your work has improved significantly. You're more confident in meetings, more decisive in your recommendations, more willing to challenge ideas that don't make sense. You're contributing at a higher level than you were 6 months ago." I sat there trying to process what he was saying, waiting for the but that would undercut the compliment. Instead, he said, "I'm promoting you to senior account manager. You've earned it." I was stunned. Not because I didn't deserve the promotion, by that point I knew my worth, but because I had assumed that my refusal to tolerate disrespect would cost me professionally. I had believed the lie that being liked was more important than being respected, that going along to get along was the path to advancement. But Marcus's unexpected promotion revealed a truth I hadn't fully grasped. People respect strength, even when that strength makes them uncomfortable. By refusing to accept disrespect, I had paradoxically earned more respect than I ever had when I was trying to be everyone's favorite colleague. The promotion changed some dynamics in the office. As a senior account manager, I had more authority, which meant I could influence the culture in ways I couldn't before. I made it clear in my first meeting with my new team that disrespectful behavior would not be tolerated in any form. No jokes at anyone's expense, no unsolicited comments about appearance, no interrupting or dismissing people's contributions. Some team members chafed at these expectations initially, used to a more casual environment where certain behaviors were considered normal. But I enforced the standards consistently, calling out violations immediately and directly, and gradually the culture of my team began to shift. People became more thoughtful in their interactions, more aware of how their words affected others, more willing to challenge disrespectful behavior when they witnessed it. Do you know what it feels like to create a space where people can be themselves without fear of ridicule or diminishment? It's one of the most rewarding aspects of leadership I've discovered, this ability to protect others from what I had endured, to model boundaries and self-respect in ways that give permission for others to do the same. I started noticing that my team members were more engaged, more creative, more willing to take risks and share ideas because they weren't spending energy protecting themselves from casual cruelty or managing other people's disrespect. When you remove the toxicity from an environment, you create space for people to thrive rather than merely survive. But my promotion and the positive changes in my immediate team didn't eliminate all the challenges. Jennifer became increasingly hostile, no longer bothering to hide her resentment behind fake concern. She would make comments in meetings about how some people were too rigid or unable to take a joke, clearly directed at me even when she didn't use my name. David stopped speaking to me entirely, treating me with cold indifference when our paths crossed. Other colleagues who had been neutral observers during my earlier confrontations now seemed to have opinions about whether I had gone too far or changed for the worse. The narrative that circulated through the office gossip mill was that success had made me arrogant, that I had forgotten where I came from, that I thought I was better than everyone else now. None of this was true, but truth is often less compelling than drama. I learned during this period that standing up for yourself means accepting that some people will mischaracterize your strength as arrogance, your boundaries as hostility, your self-respect as superiority. They will tell stories about you that bear little resemblance to reality because they need to justify their own discomfort with the change you represent. And there is nothing you can do to control their narrative except continue living your truth and trusting that the people who matter will see you clearly. One particularly difficult day, about 8 months into this journey, I found myself in the bathroom at work crying from frustration and exhaustion. A colleague from a different department came in, heard me, and instead of leaving, she sat down on the floor next to the stall I was in and waited quietly until I came out. Her name was Angela, and while we had spoken occasionally, we weren't close. But in that moment, she offered me something I desperately needed: witness and validation. She told me she had been watching what I was going through, that she understood how hard it was, that she wanted me to know I wasn't crazy or wrong or too sensitive. She said, "You're teaching people how to treat you, and some of them are angry because they preferred the version of you that didn't require them to be decent human beings. But you're on the right path. Don't let them pull you back." Angela's words that day became a touchstone I returned to whenever I doubted myself. She reminded me that changing how you show up in the world will always upset people who benefited from your previous way of being. That resistance to your growth is not evidence that you're wrong, but evidence that you're threatening a system that relied on your silence. I started building relationships with people like Angela, colleagues who valued authenticity and mutual respect, who understood that boundaries were not barriers but necessary foundations for genuine connection. These relationships were different from the superficial friendships I had maintained before. They were based on honesty rather than agreeability, on mutual support rather than social convenience. I had fewer friends in the office than I had before, but the friendships I had were deeper, more meaningful, more sustaining. One of the most profound realizations I had during this entire process was understanding the difference between being nice and being kind. I had spent years being nice, agreeable, accommodating, never causing problems, always smoothing over tensions, sacrificing my own comfort to make others comfortable. But niceness, I discovered, is often just conflict avoidance dressed up as virtue. Kindness, on the other hand, sometimes requires difficult conversations and uncomfortable confrontations. True kindness means caring enough about people, including yourself, to be honest even when honesty is hard. By calling out disrespect, I was being kind to myself and, paradoxically, to the people whose behavior I was challenging. I was giving them the opportunity to grow, to see their blind spots, to become better versions of themselves. Not everyone took that opportunity, but some did, and those relationships deepened in ways that superficial niceness never could have achieved. As I approached the one-year anniversary of that first moment in the conference room when I decided to stop accepting disrespect, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed. I was stronger, more confident, more certain of my worth. I had better professional relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenience. I slept better, ate better, felt better in my own skin. The anxiety that had plagued me for years had diminished significantly because I was no longer carrying the weight of unspoken truths and unexpressed boundaries. But the most important change was internal. I had reclaimed my voice and with it, my sense of self. I was no longer performing a version of myself designed to please others or avoid conflict. I was simply being myself, fully and unapologetically, and allowing others to do with that what they would. The freedom in that authenticity was worth every uncomfortable conversation, every lost friendship, every moment of doubt. I had learned that you teach people how to treat you not just through what you say, but through what you tolerate. And I was no longer willing to tolerate disrespect in any form. Of course, the journey didn't end there. Setting boundaries and calling out disrespect is not a destination, but an ongoing practice. Something you have to choose again and again in different contexts and with different people. Even now, I sometimes find myself in situations where someone says something disrespectful, and I feel that old familiar pull to let it slide, to avoid confrontation, to prioritize their comfort over my own. The difference is that now I recognize that pull for what it is, a trained response, a survival mechanism from a time when I didn't believe I had the right to demand better. And I pause, take a breath, and choose differently. I choose to speak up, to state my boundary clearly, to trust that I can handle whatever reaction my honesty provokes. Some people might wonder if I ever regret the path I chose, if I ever wish I had just stayed quiet and kept the peace. The answer is no, never, not even for a moment. Because I know now what I didn't know before. Peace built on your own silence is not peace at all. It's just delayed suffering. Real peace comes from living in integrity with your values, from treating yourself with the same respect you offer others, from refusing to participate in your own diminishment. And that kind of peace, the peace that comes from self-respect and authentic living, is worth fighting for. Looking back now, I can see how the person I was a year ago and the person I am today are connected but fundamentally different. The old Sarah believed that being accommodating was a virtue, that absorbing other people's disrespect was a sign of strength, that speaking up would cost her more than staying silent. She was wrong about all of it. The new Sarah understands that accommodation without boundaries is just self-abandonment, that tolerating disrespect is not strength but self-harm, that speaking up has costs but silence costs more. I wish I could go back and tell the old Sarah what I know now, but that's not how growth works. We learn through experience, through making mistakes, through paying prices, and discovering what we're willing to sacrifice and what we're not. My journey from tolerating disrespect to calling it out every time has taught me lessons I could never have learned any other way. It taught me that most people will treat you exactly as badly as you allow them to, not because they're evil, but because humans naturally conserve energy and respect, giving it only where it's required. It taught me that discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's evidence that you're doing something right, something that threatens an unjust status quo. It taught me that losing relationships built on your silence is not losing anything valuable because those relationships were never really about you anyway. They were about the convenient fiction of you that others preferred. It taught me that the people who truly care about you will adjust when you set boundaries. will listen when you express discomfort, will grow alongside you rather than punishing you for growing. Most importantly, it taught me that self-respect is not something you're born with, but something you practice. A muscle you strengthen through repeated use, a skill you develop through trial and error and countless small acts of courage. Every time you call out disrespect, you're doing a repetition in your self-respect workout, building strength that makes the next confrontation a little easier, the next boundary a little clearer, the next moment of advocacy a little more natural. And here's something I want you to understand if you're in a situation similar to what I experienced. You are not being too sensitive. You are not overreacting. You are not difficult or dramatic or unreasonable. If something feels disrespectful to you, it probably is, and you have every right to name it and address it. The people who benefit from your tolerance of disrespect will always tell you that you're making a big deal out of nothing, that you need to lighten up, that you're taking things too personally. But your feelings are valid data points, signals from your internal compass telling you that something is wrong. Trust them. Trust yourself. You deserve to work in an environment where you're treated with dignity. You deserve relationships built on mutual respect rather than unequal power dynamics. You deserve to speak your truth without fear of retaliation. And if the people around you can't provide that, then either the environment needs to change or you need to find a different environment. I'm not going to tell you that standing up for yourself is easy or that everyone will respond positively when you start setting boundaries. Some people will push back hard. Some will paint you as the villain. Some will try to manipulate you back into silence by suggesting that your boundary setting is hurting them or disrupting the peace. And yes, there will be moments when you question yourself, when you wonder if you're being too rigid or too demanding, when the loneliness of standing alone in your truth feels overwhelming. But I promise you this, the temporary discomfort of confrontation is far less damaging than the chronic pain of silence. The relationships you lose by setting boundaries are relationships that were costing you your self-respect. The people who leave your life when you start advocating for yourself are people who preferred you diminished. And while there is grief in those losses, there is also liberation. You are making space for better relationships, healthier dynamics, a version of yourself that isn't constantly performing or protecting or pretending. So what do I want you to take away from my story? First, start paying attention to how people talk to you and about you. Notice the comments that make you feel small or uncomfortable. Stop dismissing your own reactions as oversensitivity. Your discomfort is information. Listen to it. Second, practice calling out disrespect in low-stakes situations so you build confidence for the higher-stakes confrontations. You don't have to give a speech or create a scene. Sometimes a simple, "That comment was disrespectful, please don't say things like that to me," is enough. The goal is not to punish people, but to clearly communicate your boundaries. Third, prepare yourself for pushback and decide in advance that you won't let other people's discomfort pull you back into silence. People will call you sensitive, dramatic, difficult, too much. Let them. Their labels are not your truth. Fourth, find your people. The ones who respect boundaries and value authenticity. The ones who will support you when you're standing up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. You can't do this alone. You need witnesses and allies who remind you that you're not crazy. Finally, remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint. You're not going to transform your life or your environment overnight. There will be setbacks and moments when you slip back into old patterns. Be patient with yourself. Celebrate small victories. Keep choosing self-respect even when it's hard. Every time you call out disrespect, you're sending a message to yourself and others that you matter, that your dignity is non-negotiable, that you are worthy of respect. And the more you send that message, the more you'll believe it. And the more you believe it, the more it becomes true in every area of your life. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you struggled with calling out disrespect because you were afraid of the consequences? I want to hear your story. Comment below and share your experience, whether you're still in the process of finding your voice or you've already made the journey I've described. Your story matters, and sharing it helps others who are struggling with the same issues feel less alone. And listen, I know how hard this is. I know the fear that comes with speaking up when you've spent years staying silent. I know the exhaustion of constantly having to defend your right to basic respect. I know the loneliness of standing up for yourself when everyone else seems content with the status quo. But I also know the joy of reclaiming your voice, the relief of living in integrity with your values, the peace that comes from treating yourself with the respect you deserve. It's worth it. You're worth it. Your peace of mind, your dignity, your sense of self, these things are worth fighting for. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own experiences, if it gave you courage to set a boundary you've been afraid to set, Please leave a like on this video. Your engagement helps this content reach other people who need to hear this message, who are struggling in silence and need to know they're not alone. And if you want more stories like this, real experiences from real people living through difficult situations and finding their way to the other side, please subscribe to Living Through It. Click that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. This channel exists to share authentic stories of growth, resilience, and transformation, to create a community of people who understand that life is messy and hard, but also beautiful and full of possibility when we have the courage to live it honestly. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here, for caring enough to watch until the end. Whatever you're going through right now, whatever boundary you're contemplating setting, whatever disrespect you're considering calling out, I want you to know that you're not alone. There are thousands of us who have walked this path, who understand what it costs and what it gives, who are cheering you on even if we'll never meet. You deserve respect. You deserve dignity. You deserve to live and work in environments where your humanity is honored. And if the people around you can't provide that, then you have every right to demand it or walk away. Your voice matters. Your boundaries matter. You matter. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. Take care of yourself, be kind to yourself, and remember that standing up for yourself is not selfish. It's necessary. See you in the next video.